caregiving population looks like. And so, for example, we know from the research that at any one moment in time, about 75 to 80% of your workforce identifies with being a caregiver of some kind right now.
Wow.
Of course, that
Wow.
changes over time, right? Whether you have children or you're caring for a sibling or an aging parent, whatever the case might be. But there is a life cycle, a cycle to care and caregiving that happens across our work lives, and it shifts and changes, and the
Mhm.
needs shift and change too. It's not yes, early on it is about childcare. Yes, it is about parental leave, and those are critically important because they happen early in our careers at really key moments when they affect the trajectory of our careers. And that's why there's so much emphasis there. But it doesn't stop there, it continues on. And so employers having a just a transparency and a visibility around what their population looks like in terms of caregiving and what those needs are. They just
Mhm.
they don't, because there's a lot of concern about risk, about oh, I can't ask them about that, right? Because there's risk associated from a legal perspective and being able to do that. And then the flip side is if they do offer these benefits that Brad was talking about, many of them may not even use them because, again, there's concern that if I self-identify in needing these benefits as a caregiver, that there's all this stigma and I'm gonna get punished in some way, or they're
Right.
gonna withhold opportunities from me because now I've identified as being this busy mom who doesn't have time, and I'm not committed to the workplace anymore. And yes, it happens more to women, but today we do see that from a caregiving perspective, when men step up and they do lean into these identities as well, that they can be penalized also.
So this caregiving role, I'm thinking even in terms of, women in my research, women are penalized for promotions just at childbearing age, whether or not they
Yeah.
choose
Yep.
or are able to have children. It's just she could
Yep.
have a child, right? But I'm wondering if we can just think a little bit more about then the role of the leader. So
Mhm.
you're saying, like I was thinking too when you were saying, Brad, about like, well, we need to have, equal caregiving policies. But like you referred to, David, would mostly the men take it, like somehow I don't need it. I had a week. That's fine. Her mom's there, whatever she might say. And there I'm talking about the younger ages, maybe the childbearing ages. I'm thinking about the baby boomers getting older. Think of all the caregiving to come, right? As this generation ages. But what responsibility then, what opportunity do we as leaders have to be able to somehow do more than words and exemplify this so something sticks?
Yeah. There's so much here, and I wanna frame this as a business opportunity, specifically. This is not a nice to have, Don, and I think too
Yeah.
often the benefits that we're referring to here have been framed that way. Well, it's kind of it's kind of icing on the cake. Fundamentally, this is a competitive advantage if you're a leader who gets this right, and
Mm,
so here's some of the things I think you need to do. Number 1, you need to own this. Stop siloing this in a poorly funded HR department, right?
mm,
Let's let
mm,
them handle it.
mm.
Leaders need to own this. They need to be front and center. This is part of my portfolio. I'm going to make sure that we're responding to the needs of our caregiving workforce because I know it's a competitive advantage. Number 2, I'm going to do things like conduct listening sessions. I
Right.
want to find out, how are my employees doing? And perhaps I'll start with women, across different levels in the organization and just listen. How are we doing as an organization in meeting your needs
Mm,
outside the workplace? How could we get the most from you in terms of performance by offering benefits that you actually want and need? Maybe it's caregiving, maybe it's paid leave. We want to know about that. Then let's look at the data. If I'm a leader, I want to demand good data. I
yeah.
want to find out if we're talking about gender, I want to find out how we're doing when it comes to hiring the best talent who happens to identify as female, retaining those women once we have them on board, and then elevating them to key leadership roles so we actually
Mhm.
get to gender balance in leadership. If that's not happening, I want the data about why, right? So part of that might be listening sessions, but I'd like to find out, are women checking the box around caregiving, or is there something else when they leave the organization? On those exit interviews, what
Mhm.
aren't we doing the way we could be? And so women are leaving. We're bleeding talent that happens to identify as women.
Right.
So those are just a few things I might start with.
So many, so many. I have a know before they go sort of free assessment. I have a QR code even at the end here, but it's on my website, dawnwygraber.com. And it's just the sense of, that at exit interviews, from my understanding, women don't tend to, like, they're over it by then. They don't
Yeah.
tend to get into all the reasons why,
Yeah.
but there are some clues ahead of time, when she stops volunteering for that extra role, when she stops trying to speak up as much as she had been before in meetings. So we need to clue in. I love what you were saying about just starting with listening, like, how can we meet your needs better? What would be some benefits that would truly meet your needs now? Because we don't want to lose you, this whole sense of not wanting, of retention. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the folks we interviewed for the new book said, he's got a high talent woman that he wants to promote to that next rung. And if she says no, he'll go to her and say, "What would it take? What do we need to do?"
Ooh.
That's a light bulb opportunity, right? That helps me understand what are the inhibitions, what's keeping her from saying yes.
Yeah, what would have to be true in order for you to take this
Yeah.
role? I love that. What would have to be true? Well, what about, let's make sure we get on the table. Thank you for all those, just, like a few seeds of structural sort of things that we as leaders could do better on to be able to let men and women flourish in their desired roles, their capable roles. But let's go back to just this word allyship. I think of you both as Navy men, ship, right? And, and I'm not funny, so that's not a joke, allyship. But like, what does that mean? I mean, what would you have us to know, especially the men on the calls, maybe the women on this recording that are like, "Oh, I need that. I wish he would do that with me." What does that mean?
Yeah, it's interesting that allyship has become a little bit of a loaded word,
Yeah.
um,
Mhm.
especially more recently. But even when Brad and I started doing the research for our second book, Good Guys, that focused on male allies, it was at the time. This was in 2017, 2018, and allyship wasn't necessarily a widespread word that people used or understood what it was, and it had been used in certain circles, and certainly in the LGBTQ communities had been used for quite a while, and a little bit around race as well, but it had never really been used too much around gender. And I know that when we started doing this work, it was one of these where we'd have to explain, what do you mean by allyship? And so it's a great question. And today we have a different challenge. Today, there's a lot of meanings for what allyship is or what it isn't,
Mm.
and people will argue all day about this. And so we just like to make it very operational or practical in terms of the behaviors that we
Okay.
see in defining what allyship is. So we see them in three key areas. And the first is around interpersonal allyship. And we can think about this as terms of, how do I show up in the workplace and the kinds of relationships that I have, and being supportive and being collaborative, collegial. How am I working on my own awareness and self-awareness and understanding? Am I doing a lot of that listening, skill building work that I need to be doing? In many ways, this is really the easy part of allyship, because it's all on you to really think about, how
Mm.
am I doing this? How am I doing the self-education? How am I interacting with people and showing up in the workplace? The harder parts of allyship, when we were doing the research, really men told us that it's really about these public behaviors. When I have to go out there, and it's not just about me, but it's about other people as well at the same time, and this public form of allyship can lead to things like disruption or confrontation, or public advocacy for a group that I don't necessarily identify with. And they said this was really the hard part, where I felt
Mm,
like I was really putting some skin in the game, maybe feeling a little risk in the workplace, because now I'm not just holding myself accountable for doing the work, but now I'm holding other people accountable for it at the same time. And
mm,
that can feel really challenging when you're talking about peers and maybe even your leaders. And that leads to the what we think is one of the hardest forms of allyship, and that's really about we think of as structural or systemic allyship. And now, as you begin to understand how bias can operate in everyday practices you might have in your workplace that are causing maybe some of the inequities, like a wage gap or a lack of representation in senior leadership positions, which we know is fairly common. But now, as I begin to understand what causes those things, how do I change back to the structure? How do I change the practice
mm,
that's causing it? Right. So it's
mm,
not just doing this for one person in the moment. This is doing something that changes the practice or the policy so that we can make this work for everyone. And when we say everyone, we truly do mean for everyone. It will benefit women. In many cases, these changes are designed to help women to become the leaders and to step into those roles that we need them to do. But it also helps men at the same
mm,
time.
mm.
It helps everyone and makes life better professionally, better at home if we change policies related to work